Well, hello. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the 5th Annual Atlanta Radical Book Fair. We're really happy to be back after 2 years. Since we were last together in 2019, multiple problems in our society have sharpened into crises. Of course, we're still living with the risk of COVID, so please, we ask that you keep your mask on, covering your mouth and nose to ensure that we're keeping each other safe. We've let the panelists remove their masks because it's very difficult to talk when you're trying to breathe through a mask today, but if we could keep them on the rest of the time. We're also facing several social crises, from racist police violence to housing and job insecurities to ecological destruction to attacks on queers and youth. Today's panels will reflect on some of these crises and point to ways forward as we together build a new world. The first panel today will feature author Vicky Osterweil, an activist from Unity and Struggle, to reflect on the protests and riots in the 2020 George Floyd rebellion. The second panel at 2:15 will feature author Modibo Kadali, an activist from the movement to stop Cop City and defend Weelaunee Forest, to discuss strategies for land back and abolition. Atlanta, of course, was built on Muskogee land, and in the last year and a half, Muskogee people have been returning to this land and participating in the movement to defend the forest. The third panel at 3:45 will feature activists reflecting on the current right-wing repression of education, from Don't Say Gay bills to attacks on teaching critical race theory, and they'll discuss how to organize in one of the most important battlegrounds today, schools. Our keynote speaker at 5 is William C. Anderson, author of The Nation on No Map. He'll deliver a talk titled Citizen Nowhere, Statelessness, Disaster, and Struggle, about transcending the shortcomings of Western radicalism and addressing the needs of people who fall outside the considerations of civil society, the state, and even radical left politics. So before I hand it over to our first panelist, we want to take a second and thank the Auburn Avenue Research Library, and especially Morris Gardner, and Ruben, who's running things behind the scenes from the top there. So thank you for helping to make this year's book fair possible. I also want to thank all the vendors, some of whom have traveled from out of the city or out of the state, and panelists as well, some of whom have traveled. And finally, thank you all for making this possible yet again and making it so successful year after year. So we hope that today you find a new book or two, a new friend or two, and can leave here feeling inspired to continue the fight. So without further delay, please welcome our first panelists, Lamont Carter, Chino, and Vicky Osterwall.
Hi, everybody. I'm Vicky Osterweil. I'm a writer and activist based in Philadelphia. Let's just say intros and then I'll jump into it.
Hello, everyone. My name's Lamont. I am a writer and organizer in the Pacific Northwest.
My name is Chino. That's not bad. Check. Hey. Hey, my name's Chino Mayday. I'm an organizer and an activist in New York, in the Bronx. And I'm a member of the group Unity and Struggle, that little table out there.
So yeah, we wanted to talk about this panel. We were talking about a piece that Unity and Struggle produced this year called Big Brick Energy, a multi-city study of the 2020 George Floyd Uprising. And we'll talk about, I'll let them, I'll let them talk about it. They're in Unity and Struggle. But the broader things that we want to talk about, other than in this piece, and what they were trying to get at with the piece, and what we share, is a desire to really understand and take seriously the not just the importance of the uprising, which I think everyone agrees with, but to contextualize it in both the history of recent struggles and the continuing social activism that I think is often disconnected from it, around mutual aid, the Great Resignation, for example. There's lots of things I think that it's basically, as often happens with rebellions, even ones as absolutely massive as George Floyd, it gets pulled out of history and it's oh, it's this weird flashpoint that happened for a summer and it's over and it'll never come back and it has no effect. And then then 100 years later, people are and that was when it started, So I think we want to basically create a space where we are back in the space of the summer of 2020 a little bit, to be thinking in that way. We've been living through 2 years of really, really intense fascist counter-revolution, mostly using the pandemic to spread both disposability and to break solidarity among people around COVID. We've been living through a really nasty period, and it can be hard to remember how in the summer of 2020 it felt like maybe actually we were going to get this thing. Trump was hiding in a bunker, there's a police precincts and police cars on fire all over the country. So we're going to sort of get into that headspace a little bit, and then we're going to talk about some context and about some future possibilities. And I think that's sort of what we wanted to say. So, you're starting, I think. So we're going to talk about, so we're all in different cities, so we're going to talk about our experiences in 2020 briefly, and then we're going to get into Big Brick Energy and conclusions.
Cool. And we can all do that too. Does everybody else feel that? It's like the 2020 like just happened, but it's also like 100 years ago. And let's do like a 5 second, this is like eating up panel time. Let's do a 5 second, like breathe and think about where you were, how you were feeling physically, what you were seeing on social media and in person, wherever you were, whatever you're doing. Don't talk about it if it was dicey, you know. What was going on in 2020 as the uprising broke out? Let's do a breath. Oh, wild. Okay. All right. So, like I said, I've been in the Bronx for a long time, and at the time I was organizing with a group called Take Back the Bronx. But my household was very like worried about COVID. So as the uprising kicked off, it was like, oh wow, there's another round of pretty militant, anti-police stuff happening. That's great. And then shit blew up in New York, the Lower Manhattan and downtown Brooklyn. The Bronx a little bit further away from that. And so the immediate reaction was wanting to go, but also our household was like, should we go out or not? It's pre-vaccine, right? And if you're concerned about health, right? So we are stuck in this kind of the weird wanting to go out, not sure thing. There's a little bit of a lag, and then the Bronx is like immediate mass looting. No protests, no rallies. It's just like everyone's like, oh shit, did you see all the teenagers around Fordham Road? Because the Bronx has a little bit less of that like activist and NGO layer, right? And a little bit more like political machine and then poor working class and new immigrant and lumpen, So people were just like on it. So you went from being like, whoa, I saw a photo of they torched the NYPD cruiser. That's wild, this is real different. To like, whoa, a lot of people texting, I'm just running out, I'm trying to meet up with the teenagers that are out there. Like they're hitting the Foot Locker, they're all up and down Fordham Road. People saw their ops in the street, like saw shit go down, and then they were like, okay, we're not gonna do this now. We're gonna go get a huge buzzsaw and crack the pawn shop and get Abuela's jewelry back. And like shit that people heard in the street, So it felt like a weird sense in my own household, a sense of hesitation, events moving very fast and trying to figure out how to relate to them and connect to them. And then with the more activist networks, like organizing, more like a march and rally thing, and unfortunately catching the heavy police repression at that time. Because you're a little late, and at that point the cops are like, all right, now we're gonna do a curfew, now we're gonna crack skulls, now we're gonna send people all over the city to be processed. So then my own experience was a lot of organizing that, and then the jail support for that afterward. Yeah, maybe a atypical 2020, I don't know.
So, like I said, I'm in Pacific Northwest, specifically Seattle. I came into Seattle in the tail end of the post-Ferguson movement and the uprisings then. And so it had just been kind of quiet in the city for a long time since the end of the post-Ferguson wave. And I remember, just seeing what happened to George Floyd on social media. And in a lot of these cases, it's a similar situation. We've always seen on social media violence against black people, police brutality, et cetera. And you wonder what happens after this. And it immediately popped off, especially in Minneapolis, which had a history of it since back in the Black Lives Matter post-Ferguson wave, which escalated even more. And then, it just happened everywhere. All of a sudden, you were seeing the riot taken up in every single city, where people were in Seattle, they burning cop cars, trying to take weapons out of the burning cop cars, setting the Macy's downtown on fire, and then one day it kind of comes to a stalemate where people are kind of lining up on against the police lines. They are shooting off tear gas and everybody's dispersing, And then one night, mysteriously, to this day it's mysterious, nobody knows why the cops abandoned the precinct, but they abandoned the precinct and Chaz started. I think at that time it was Chop, to later become Chaz. But all of a sudden, there were barricades. Capitol Hill has been, for at least 4 blocks on each side, like a square, it's been taken over, and police aren't allowed in there, things like that. And so, yeah, all of a sudden, it feels like it is almost out of nowhere that these things kind of come up, explode, and move the situation forward, and then kind of just as quickly receded away.
Yeah, so I'm in Philly, and the pattern is again different from both of those cities. So in Philly, there's a pretty big activist left that's pretty organized and pretty effective at wet blanketing any energy in the city. They're very good at it. So they like to have demos at the art museum in the center of the city. So the Saturday after the precinct goes up, they call one, and it's just massive. Like biking there, like just the entire city. You see everyone's moving there, and usually center cities where demos go to die. But in this instance, it's so there's the march, and there's this sort of march, and it feels just like the standard march, just with more people. It's really frustrating. And then as we're sort of walking back towards the art museum, a comrade runs up and is like, "Yo, they're fighting cops up on Arch Street. Like, you got to get over there." So we go up to Broad, and there are cop cars on fire, right? And there's this crowd that had been there for this sort of respectable demo, called by the orgs, that has lit these cop cars on fire. Everyone's like fighting with the police. The police form a line successfully between sort of Center City and North Philly, basically, and push us back. We sort of, they don't really push anything that day, but we decide to move back down south because we're sort of stopped at their line. Frank Rizzo, who was like the police commissioner and a fascist mayor, has had a statue that has been protested for 20 years outside. That statue gets fucked up. More cop cars get fucked up. Excuse me for cussing. And then we loot. People loot a Starbucks that's there's like a little pop-up Starbucks that has been built in the public park to like take up all this space. So it gets looted and lit, and they take all these frozen bagels and they start throwing them through the windows of City Hall. And City Hall's, all its windows get smashed out. In Philly, it's huge. It's a block-long building on 4 sides. It's this massive, kind of beautiful building, and people are getting it. But the cops finally managed to stop us at City Hall, right? They surround it. They stop us from taking out this building, which would have been, it would have been wild if we'd taken it over. So there's a bit of that stalemate thing again. And then I hear the most beautiful chant I have ever heard in my life. Someone from back in the crowd starts chanting, "Apple Store, Apple Store, Apple Store." And everyone just rushes down 15th to Walnut, where there's a business district, and there's just a whole afternoon of looting. People build barricades in the street, burning barricades, cars are like blocked off. The whole zone is like no cops. There's this super bougie park, Rittenhouse Park, right off the shopping district. And after everyone gets tired of looting, they all sit in Rittenhouse Park together, and they're showing each other what they got. People are showing off their stuff, hanging out. The cops are standing there like motherfuckers, like no one, everyone's ignoring them. From there, there's 3 days of super dispersed rioting and looting all over the city. Center City is pretty isolated. Like Philly is very broken into north, south, and west, and so every neighborhood there's like crazy looting, fighting with the police. Famously in Philly, people are blowing up ATMs with dynamite. There's a lot of organized criminals. Someone drives a forklift into a bank wall and takes out all the money, and then 6 months later, he posted about it on Instagram. He got busted. It was so dumb, but that was beautiful. So there's all this like really crazy, creative looting going on, fighting, and then eventually, as the week goes, it sort of collapses. But there's been this big unhoused movement developing in Philly since 2018. So we open an encampment there, and for the rest of the summer, there's an encampment there. There's another one up at PHA, which is like the Philadelphia Housing Authority, who are sort of the big slumlords run by the state, and we actually win. We kind of win that struggle. We get 60 houses from PHA it's now in a land trust, and that's complicated because now there's a nonprofit. There's some messy shit. One of the core organizers of that died from COVID recently, so there's a lot of it's messy and really hard right now but like there was this big win, and then and not without everyone saying that everyone betrayed everyone and everyone was an activist and it was terrible, and you know how it goes. And then in October, and the last day of October, beginning of November, another black man is killed in Philadelphia, Walter Wallace, and there's another 2 days of riots, what they call in the piece a double bump uprising. And in that uprising, people actually go really, really hard against the police. Police got fucked up, like they got hurt. They were like back at the station like complaining, like that was a really like violent. And then the next day and the day after that, the police went really wild. And so that was really brief-lived, really intense, like really, really intense, largely not driven by the activist left at all, or really involving them. And in fact, at one key instance, they really intervened in a particularly nasty, swoopy way, whatever. I don't have to talk about it. But yeah, so there was this sort of, but that was like 3 days before the election, right? So it's just sort of gone. Suddenly it's all the election 2020, and then that's it. So that's sort of, that was 2020 in Philly, sort of, in short.
And so one of the things that I think all of us are interested in is thinking about what the George Floyd uprisings meant and how it pushed forward things. In 2020, it kind of came and went, and it was a huge moment, but we have to understand the uprisings as an extension of this black autonomous rebellion that has been happening since about 2008, 2009. Originally, I would say that the start of it is really in Oakland during the Oscar Grant protests, which is extremely localized. It's very much kept in the Bay, but very militant, very wild, very riotous. Then I would say the next thing that kind of came from that is the Trayvon Martin movements. So that one was, widespread, nationwide, but was less militant, less riotous, but a start to some tactics that we would see later on, like taking the highways and things like that. Obviously, the next wave of that was post-Ferguson, and I say post-Ferguson because I don't like saying Black Lives Matter because it's an organization and it wasn't their movement, but I understand that's my issue. That's my issue. But so the post-Ferguson wave, you have it is both nationalized and then it is also taking up more militancy, especially in Ferguson, especially in Baltimore, where riots happen for days and weeks. And then this one, the George Floyd uprisings happened and immediately in every city, the riot tactic is taken up. We push right past the limitations of the post-Ferguson wave almost immediately, where rioting, looting, blockades, all of these different experimental forms that we had been trying in the past are starting to happen everywhere, in the streets constantly, and that stays, that level stays up for a long, long time until, as waves previously, it starts to recede. And so we wrote Big Brick Energy. It's been kind of a more or less a year-long process of kind of thinking of what we wanted to do. You can also pick this up at our table, the Unity and Struggle table, if you like. But we, it is in color. So one thing that what we did was interview a bunch of people in different cities, 15 different people in 5 different cities, talking about what happened in those cities during the full span of the uprisings. So one thing that we were trying to get away from is just the hot take think pieces that a lot of people were dropping, no names, but those in a lot of ways those were limited to just the one cities that they were in for a limited time period that they were participating. And so we wanted to really get a look at how the wave started, what caused the wave to recede, what was happening, what tactics were being taken up, what changes were happening in the cities, in the spaces that were being created by this. And so what we hope that we were able to accomplish with writing Big Brick Energy is looking at what the limitations of that moment were and how we can push past those going forward.
What's the reason for doing such a thing? Because we need to have drawn some lessons and clarified some questions and problems for next time, because there's going to be a next time. So one set of things are like lessons, things that definitely worked and definitely didn't work. Another set of things are like, maybe we all don't have the answer to it right now, but it was a type of question or challenge that was clearly posed that people ran into in multiple cities, and that type of thing is likely to occur again, you know? So that's a chunk of what's in here, and it's like a think tank report for people that like to think about burning cop cars. And we thought we could highlight a couple of those questions too. Like you can get the lessons and like the general trends, but like what are the questions and problems that we all need to think about and figure out some answers to between now and the next time shit pops off, hopefully soon. One of them is, well, it's a question of like how to frame it, but it's the when and how do we push forward the uprising, like make more insurrection, you know? And when and how do we make demands and consolidate gains? And we thought that was an important one to pose kind of in that way, because depending on the left-ish like scene or milieu that you're a part of or the theory that you reference, those things are often talked about as being totally opposed. Right? There's sort of an insurrectionary perspective and, like, for lack of something better, a socialist perspective. And the insurrectionary perspective both have like strong points and sort of truth to them. Right? The insurrectionary perspective is like the strength of the insurrection or the riot or the rebellion is what it does. It's what it imposes. It's like us expropriating shit, it's us taking territory, it's us driving the state out of areas and creating new forms of life. Like, yeah, that's the content of what a revolution is. And there's the danger of stopping and pausing and negotiating, because as soon as you're like, okay, state, this is what I want, then you're presuming the existence of a state and a ruling class that's going to be there at the end of the thing, right? And you gain a few things. So there's always the danger of co-optation. So that's kind of the view of like the rebellion's like a shark. It has to keep swimming or it dies. However, and that was very true in many moments of the uprising. People felt that, like that was the strength of what was going on. You know, it's amazing. And I think that's part of what impacted all of us. At the same time, the people we talked to in many cities described moments where that hit limits. And not just limits of the violence from the cops, but like internal limits. You know? It's what like the military calls that the exhaustion point, the communization people call that the internal limit, like where the practices and concepts that have allowed the movement to move forward have kind of exhausted themselves, and then they need to evolve in order for the thing to keep going, or else it's going to decline. So people had different ways of describing that in different cities. Sometimes it was a capacity thing, like literally what's our, as activists and organizers, but as communities, what's our ability to sustain and reproduce an uprising? Like, yeah, we had little jail support crews that we've done in protest for a while, but now this is happening on such a scale and with such continuity, we can't help everybody out when they're getting popped and track them through the system, you know? Or in Minneapolis, comrades described like, we straight up looted much of the city, which was great, and then we immediately had food deserts across big chunks of the city, right? And it was like, oh crap, our mutual aid networks can't scale up, but who can scale up is the NGOs and, right, people with some state money, right? And there's a vacuum to be filled. So it's like, wow, what is our scale of organization? Do we have relationship with the farm workers upstate? Like, damn, the ability to materially reproduce it. There's also limits of like politics and vision. So some people described like, it felt like we were marching across, we'd won, we'd driven the cops off the street, but we were marching over the same bridge again. And like, where exactly is this going, right? And then there starts to be a lack of clarity about what's the next move, are we gonna occupy something, are we making demands, and if so, what, right? And into that flow all the left sectarian claims about what we should be doing, and all the official politics comes in to start defining for us what the meaning and purpose of the movement is, right? So all the questions of organization, program, and whatnot, they come up internally within the rebellion itself, not because some socialist says that's what we needed in 1917. It's because that's actually how the uprising unfolds. Okay, flip side is the socialist perspective that's like, rebellions are extremely powerful, morally correct, but also like maybe a little bit regrettable because they're super powerful, but they come and go, and they're a flash in the pan. And then without some sort of program, strategy, demands, and reforms, we don't consolidate anything, and then in comes the ruling class to define it. And that's why you should take up our program in our newspaper to implement what we already knew was the answer that we should be implementing. Right? Both perspectives were like, man, both of these are kind of like, I don't know. Like, both were very true in the uprising at different moments, right? Because the uprising did hit certain limits, and then you needed to have some sort of idea about what you were going to do, or else you're just going to do what the nonprofits say. So both things were sort of needed. That's part of what we're posing. How do we judge which moment we're in of the uprising? How do we do both effectively? And I'll add on the like demands reform side, if we're winning shit, how do we win it in such a way that it makes it easier for us to live and organize autonomously and harder for them to rule? The reforms, the danger of them is what? They get more legitimacy at the end of it. Right? We're like, yeah, fuck most of these people except the 3 city council people that gave us the, whatever the reform might be, they're all right. And then there's a renewed legitimacy. The ruling class unites around that because it seems like there's an emerging deal with the base of the uprising that'll chill shit out, right? So instead of them being divided and fighting amongst each other about what to do, right, they start to unite and get more legitimacy. Ideally, we should come out of some sort of cycle of rebellion where right, we have more ability to organize and live our own lives. We're living better living conditions, but also the state, the ruling class hegemony is like a little shakier. It's a little more like, this shit could pop off again pretty soon, but we had to give them this. That's one question.
And then another question that we looked at that was a trend in many of the cities that we were talking about, or we were talking to, was this tension between multiracial unity and Black autonomy. And you see early on in the early days of the rebellions, this multiracial unity in the riots, where it is easy to show that you are in some ways down, that you can be trusted because the energy is high, everybody is taking part in very obvious actions, and so who you're able to like work with is very, very clear, because the people who are trying to stop you from looting this place or burning down a precinct are not the people to be fucked with. You don't want them anywhere near you. So it was easier to have these levels of kind of multiracial unity within the riot itself, where it's not as if like blackness or whiteness goes away in those moments, but we are working towards how that solidarity looks like moving forward. Then as this is kind of not allowed, but the space is found for this because the riot catches the cops off guard, catches official politics off guard. The NGOs have no idea what to do. They're just like, fuck, God. So everybody is able to find this space and find the rebellion and find the energy in the streets where nobody is trying to challenge it for the most part. If there is a challenge to it, it's the cops, and the cops need to be beat down. And it's very clear where the lines are there. As the energy starts to diminish, the riot starts to lose its shine as a tactic. NGOs are able to start moving into these spaces, are able to start saying, okay, well, it's the outside agitators like it always is. These aren't your friends. And so in a lot of ways, white liberals start to tend towards these NGOs and say, okay, the energy, you're right, this was my bad, I didn't mean to do this. And so you start to see as the white liberals start to move back towards official politics, NGOs, et cetera, Black autonomy starts to exert itself a lot. And one of the things that we in Atlanta here is the Wendy's occupation, where that was very much a black autonomous space and very deliberately not a white space because and journalists weren't allowed, as far as we understand from our conversations, journalists weren't really allowed in that space because of the racist ways that they were talking about the occupation in the very beginnings, and so the racial categories are not reimposed; they've already existed, but that struggle to figure out where unity can still lie when this space is kind of diminished is another question that we have. And so, again, it's very easy to say, hey, the riot is the tactic because that's where the highest energy goes. But when the energy does die down, how do we reassert support for black autonomy specifically, not just multiracial unity, but allow for the spaces of black autonomy where, in Minneapolis and Atlanta and New York, things like that, how do we extend that out and support that going forward?
And I think, and I'm going to talk just a little bit now about sort of some provocations, I'll say, about what we might do in the next time, because I think as we agree, if we want to really abolish this world, there's going to have to be a next time of some shape or form like this, like 2020, and it's going to also have to be different. It's going to have to be both, right? It's going to have to be even bigger, which will be amazing when it happens. I still have faith somehow. I don't know why, but yeah. So one of the things that happened in 2020 that I do know why, actually. It's very informed by historical experience. One of the things we experienced in 2020 was that, as you were pointing to, was the reemergence of all of the tactics that took place from 2008 to 2019, right? So not just the Black Rebellion tactics, although those were there as well. Indigenous blockades, right? I don't know if people remember blocking Mount Rushmore. They were up in North Dakota. Prison strikes. Prison strikes broke out during the uprising, right? We saw Me Too style call-outs of leaders in the movement who were doing patriarchal bullshit. Every movement tactic that proved effective in the decade leading up to George Floyd in the various rebellions, from as white bread as Occupy to like the more interesting like Standing Rock, Occupy ICE, all these things all came back and were remixed and shot through both the questions of black autonomy and black rebellion, and like we saw in different cities and at different times and to different extents which tactics were effective and for how long. So what that kind of means, though, is that the playbook's a little empty. The only thing that like the George Floyd rebellion really introduced was burning down a precinct, which I think we should definitely repeat. I think that's really effective. But I think like it does mean that like we do have to think about other ways to move forward, as we've been talking about, that consolidate some of these gains without making too many sort of concessions to the structure as it exists, because I think everyone sort of agrees now, it's a general vibe that like this shit is collapsing, like they are not holding on to this, like they are just like they're gripping, the side of the cliff face, the capitalists being the they here in the state, and there's nothing really to capture from them that seems that desirable over the last 2 years, it has seemed to me, although I've always thought that, so I'm very biased. One question that was brought up was like, how do you scale up jail support? You don't have to scale up jail support if the jails are empty. I know in Philly there were three different marches where we had the numbers. There's a federal prison in downtown Philly that is just not defendable from a big crowd, and we had the numbers. It would have been intense, like, don't get me wrong, like, that's some wild shit to propose on the stage, on video. But it would have been possible to maybe make some immediate improvements to that infrastructure in Philadelphia. Historically, obviously, that is a famous trigger. The Bastille in France, which follows, years of riots in France, which we don't learn about, the French Revolution, whatever. Now I'm officially off topic. Okay. Another question that I think that is coming up that COVID has really underlined is healthcare, and with the collapse of Roe. there is this really big demand for better healthcare, holistic healthcare, as well as reproductive health, and trans autonomy, bodily autonomy of every kind. Now, Obamacare has led to a ton of privatization of hospitals and clinics around the country, and consolidation, excuse me. So there are a lot of empty, I know in Philly there are a bunch of empty hospitals and clinics all over the country. Young Lords took one over in the 60s. There's a lot of radical nurses out here, and they're very unhappy with what's going on. There's obviously, again, risks, but hospitals could be squatted. There's a lot of infrastructure that's empty or close to empty, and the workers in it don't like it. Let's think about what that infrastructure looks like and how we could take it and do we make plans locally, probably not on a stage on video, about the kind of things that we would want to take over in these instances. What would we want that would not require the state to give us anything, which they are very clearly not willing to do, and would not require the city council to give us anything, but could force them to respond to us while giving us what we want, right? Another example, I don't know if you guys noticed in 2020, there was a lot of looting, I know me and most of the people were caught off guard, and the stuff that was looted by people who I definitely saw and don't know personally was somewhat arbitrary, and it was and it was cool, but it was just whatever was around, right? Where are all the solar panels stored? Where's the Home Depot with all the solar panels so that you can manage? Where are the seeds for autonomous farming? Pharmacies, which pharmacies have big amounts of hormones in them? Learning where there are things that are in the environment that we could use and repurpose in a non-sort of value form way. That's more short term. But I think also the mutual aid, which obviously emerged during the coronavirus, the way that it intersected with the uprising, I think, is very important. Every demo I was at, there was food. People had food, water, lots of stuff. There was care for people, and those questions didn't quite get answered by mutual aid as it existed, especially because it often stayed in a service model. And I think William Anderson's going to talk more about that this evening. But I think the other question that happened that people don't talk about, that don't connect it, is the Great Resignation. A lot of people. Some of them probably because they had some cash from the unemployment, because the Trump administration pulled how much can it cost, Michael? It's one banana, right? It's $10. They gave us all huge raises because poor people live on $1,000 a month, right? So everyone had all this cash, and everyone also had this experience of telling bosses and police, "Fuck you," absolutely not. So everyone quit, and it grew in this there was the Reddit anti-work. It was very disorganized, and it wasn't the left, but it was, I think, part of the uprising, and it just didn't manage to consolidate into a thing, and now it's turned into quiet quitting, which is just how abolish got turned into defund, right? It's the same shit. It's you sort of modify your work. But so there are all these questions around the workplace, and personally, I don't favor a union model so much as but the Amazon worker, that sort of autonomous ground up stuff. There's all of these questions have been posed by the uprising in ways that we haven't necessarily connected to the uprising, but they're there. And so I think one thing we can do, because one of the beautiful things about the uprising, in my opinion, was that the left, people like me, my friends, were left behind. We were caught unaware by events did not require us. We were able to help in small ways, but the events were much bigger than us, and that was awesome. And that, we don't need, we want that going forward, but we also weren't very effective at helping. We were not particularly effective. We told people to mask up. There wasn't that many tactics we had available until it moved into a more activist-y phase. So thinking about how we can throw some accelerant onto the fire of rebellion, how we can come out of an uprising, not just with the stuff we loot, which is great, but also with maybe spaces, and not necessarily an autonomous space, but what if we came out of them with a hospital? What if there was one city where there were no jails anymore, even for a few months, And then if you empty a jail, there's immediately this question of okay, well, now we got to get these people the fuck out of here, right? Because that's dangerous. So then you immediately have to answer all these other questions that then lead to materially building community networks that can protect ourselves and each other and build a different world. So tactics that will force those questions to be asked, because as we were saying here, we can't answer those questions, and it's not the job of people who are committed to liberation to answer those questions, but we can think of tactics and moves that we can make and strategies that can ask those questions in a material way rather than theoretical way, that can ask them on the street and in the movement so that the answers will emerge from the collective intelligence of the movement in motion, and that's how we'll grow, I think. So yeah, that's sort of where we're ending, I guess. So we're opening to questions, right? Do we still have time? Yeah, thanks, y'all. You were fast. Look at us. All right, so please Q&A. There's like the mics, or there's one mic here. Come on up, and we'll try our best.
Yeah, what are y'all thinking about post-2020? One maybe. Thank you.
Sorry, that was awkwardly slow lumber over here. My question actually has to do with your observation earlier, Chino, about the socialist perspective versus, the insurrectionary perspective, and it has to do with Philly. Once socialists started making sort of institutional demands related to housing justice, I'm just curious about what happened afterwards, like the long-term viability of those demands, and then were the beneficiaries of those sort of, I don't want to say reform because I don't want to offend anyone, but like of those changes, were they satisfied with it? And how did they see sort of the activists who fought for them?
Yeah, there's a pretty in deep in some of that. So there's some complicated stuff, and we can talk in depth about it later if you want to. But the sort of the short end of it is that like the movement in Philly around housing, the socialists have largely been backstopping a tenants union that actually came out against the rent strike in April at the beginning of they literally, whatever. Again, this is local drama. We don't need it. But they do offer a lot of resources. That tenants union does offer a lot of resources that are helpful to people as well. Credit where it's due. And so the space that emerged in the occupations was largely unhoused people, many of whom, although not all of them, had been involved in 2018 Occupy ICE, which was sort of this like smaller movement wave that happened around the country. It was pretty big in Philly. Again, we won some demands, largely by a black and trans-led unhoused occupation outside City Hall. The socialists at that point had started the occupation outside of the ICE building to try and stop ICE, and they weren't really involved in the second wave of it, although they took some credit for it when demands were won. And so I think like, oh man, this is my favorite topic. Thank you for asking this. But I think like what has been interesting has been that like the result of what happened is that a lot of the infrastructure and ideas that they had built, because they couldn't control these movement spaces, they didn't really offer a lot of them. So volunteers would come from those orgs, and they did a lot of great work at the encampments. But they also were very interested in building them in the model of the way that they understood how the political worked, right? Building bureaucracies within these encampments. So building like kind of a police force within the encampments, right? During this, and that one of the reasons there were 2 camps in Philly, I'm so sorry, this is so specific. One of the reasons there were 2 camps in Philly is because a bunch of people were like, this first camp has like been totally taken over by all these donations and all this money and all this bureaucracy, and we need to be pushing harder against PHA directly. And so that camp opened up right outside their offices and built barricades and was like way more radical, also smaller. We had like this huge barricade made out of fallen trees right in front of the PHA, like their $40 million headquarters in the middle of Sharswood, which is this really poor cutoff neighborhood in North Philly that they're trying to flash gentrify. And it was on this piece of land that they wanted to develop into a parking lot as part of this flash gentrification. So because we held that land, not more than the bigger, more famous park down the Parkway, they gave in and gave us a bunch of houses. But the way it got negotiated down was that it got moved into a land trust that is still ongoing but the reason, sorry, I'm forgetting the most important part. The reason that they had to do that is because we squatted 15 houses over 2019 to 2020. We put unhoused families in 15 different PHA houses in Philadelphia. We repaired those houses. We put them in there. That was the context in which the encampment arose. So once the encampment arose, we started moving more people into more houses. So those 60 houses they gave us, 20 of them we already had, we already maintain, we already keep, right? So that's the reason that they had to do it. Like, if it had just been sort of these tents, and that was sort of this vague idea that you have houses, but we knew where their empty houses were. We knew, and it was all these years of like doing that kind of work. So a lot of that work was on the ground, locating the physical infrastructure, taking a bunch of it, and then using a movement moment to expand that into a public thing so they couldn't just evict us in the dark of night, right? I don't know if any of that is an answer to what you're saying, but I think so as a result, like, some of these questions get answered in the practical matter of trying to house these people. And then the thing that you actually win, these 60 houses, this has been it's been partially because, like I said, one of the core people, she passed away, rest in peace, Jen Bentech. And she was really the driving force behind the land trust, so it's been a mess, and that's just awful. And that has to do also with, like, domestic violence situations. So or a bad partner rather, purposely infecting her seemingly. So there's like these limits. These limits are patriarchal as well, right? There's these limits that are coming in that always infect our movements, that are like, don't seem like it's about housing, but is very much about housing. Sorry for the side note. It's pretty devastating. But yeah. Anyway, all these things. So there's all of these like moving parts, and the vision that the sort of socialist or the sort of policy demand-driven vision can be very effective if you have it at the point at which you've already taken a ton of territory and you've done a ton of work to like use an uprising to take over all these houses. But that vision on its own, like in the form of the organizations that exist in Philly, is like wildly ineffective and has like, you know, with the exception of some legal help for people, which is real and important, has not really, like, didn't really blossom into those movements at all, and it often, in fact, posed a limit to the encampment because they wanted it to be run the way they ran their eviction defense force rather than this homeless encampment with all the problems that that has.
Right, maybe speaks to some of the limits of the defund demands as well, that are just sort of aspirational budget demands without some shit on the ground that they're, okay, we'll pay for that, you know? The more broadly, I think it connects to the like, we're revolutionaries in different places, and in here there's some housing stuff because it was so quick right after. Obviously, because housing's so fucked all over the country, so as the uprising, then the energy goes immediately into some sort of struggle of unhoused people, or in different cities like the hotel occupation. In the conclusion, there's a little bit about like other places like that, but it's when one major front breaks up almost into different fronts, and then each one's a different terrain like that. Like, what are the places that we can consolidate some material thing? What are the terms on which the demands are posed? What sort of policy level is involved in it? And then you have the, you know, anything from like the workplace, trade union, or Great Resignation terrain, and probably schools and high schools are another one, because you saw the wave of student walkouts once people came back to in-person classes, right? Because all Gen Zs are like, screw the awful behavior and racism and sexism of this institution, and they're coming head to head with the fascists, you know, trying to take over their schools.
Yeah, and in terms of the sort of theoretical distinction between insurrection and sort of long-term program-y organizing, the housing occupation seemed sort of out of nowhere to the national stage, but as I said, it evolved out of 2018, which was very much a like on-the-ground street movement thing, and a bunch of the unhoused organizers like had coalesced into a group. There was a squat that was the end of Occupy ICE in Philly really ended in two squats in Sharswood for unhoused folks, one of which got broken up because of some drama, classic. But you know, like so that infrastructure was already built, and all these activists had met each other, unhoused folks and, you know, sort of anarchists, whatever, more activist-y types. Although, again, these tended to be people who were also local to North Philly and had been there for many, many years and were just like active in these things. So there is, and then those people sort of struggled together and talked about PHA and did all this stuff that like was pretty small scale and not particularly effective, and they weren't really, like, they were trying to make it work. And then 2020 happens and it pops into this huge thing, and they have this base of organizers, these 6 organizers together, who are ready to call an encampment because they've been working on this stuff for 2 years. So there's this relationship between organizing, program, and insurrection that's like totally intimate and can't be easily cut out, and that the organizers of one wave come from the insurrection, right? Like, I mean, most of us are here because we were radicalized at one movement point or another, right?
Go for it.
All right.
And let's get a couple too. We
Yeah,
like talk.
Come on,
Yeah.
Y'all need to come up and engage these people.
Right.
Really. I mean, you guys are doing a magnificent job. I don't have too much to add. I mean, come on up here. These people are very important to be questioning. I want to ask a general question. How do you see the long-term interplay between spontaneity and self-organization over periods previous to the time you were talking about? Okay, that's my question. And I'll sit down and listen.
Did folks hear the question? Yeah. Okay. Long-term interplay between spontaneity and self-organization before the uprising.
So this is actually going to be stolen from a conversation that happened last night. But the civil rights movement did not start in the 50s, nor did it start in the 40s, nor did it start in the 30s. It was over decades, decades of autonomous movements, of struggle, of uprisings, of this or that, that coalesced into a bigger movement in the late 50s, 60s, and then into the Black Power movement of the late 60s and 70s. So it will, to me, it is always a case of experimentation where we are constantly working to figure out what works, and at times, like a gear, it just catches and it starts moving on its own, and then sometimes we just have to go back to the drawing board again. But in the same way that there is this history since 2008 of all of these movements, it does not stop, and this, 2020 will not be the end of it. And I hope that we will continue to see these moments of experimentation that, again, just catch. And we can keep breaking past the limits of the last movement and keep moving forward towards liberation.
Yeah.
Like a couple more?
No, that was.
So I've been interested in this interplay between what y'all have been calling, insurrection versus socialism, and I wanted to ask about basically how that interplay works when, say, like it's at a certain scale, like it's not safe, right, to say, hey, we want to loot this store, let's put it up to make a proposal and put it up to a vote, right? But so how do we act autonomously while also holding ourselves accountable to what the people in the community want, and how do we organize in ways that are democratic enough to engage the masses and make them feel that they have input and involvement in the movement without compromising security?
So the specific point of kind of community, what the community wants, is actually like a big thing. So one thing that we saw. One thing that we saw in a number of different communities is taking up arms, and the patrols of autonomous zones, but also like community defense that was against the riots and things like that. And so, you have, it's an open question, especially as to that part, because you have a situation in which the community is not making the decisions on who is defending it. It is taken up as a tactic by just people who show up and have guns. And in a lot of places, Seattle, Atlanta, that ends in tragedy. But at the same time, there needs to be a space in which we can figure out how to do these things, how to create these new spaces, and essentially defend them, but they can't be left up to just whoever wants to do it, whoever feels like they have the authority to do it. That continues to be an open question on what we do going forward in the movements.
Yeah, that was like one of the biggest and most painful questions we posed with the armed self-defense stuff, because it was like really high stakes and people got hurt, but also then there's like threat of fascist violence, right? And so the movement is sort of compelled to start improvising in that direction. So like, what does organization along those lines look like? Yeah, one question in the back. You want to shout it? Oh, it's not a question, it's we got to shut up in 5 minutes, everybody. Okay, go ahead, yeah.
Okay, okay. So you mentioned explicitly like seeing on social media and that being a motivating factor, and you also mentioned the guy posting on Instagram and getting arrested for it. So like, it seems to be also, once again, like this internal struggle between like social media as activation tool and social media as participation in the panopticon. So like, how do you balance that as people invested in a movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think I tend to be like pretty like, I mean, I'm very bad at this myself, but like, yeah, don't post crimes online. Don't take notes on a fucking criminal conspiracy, right? It's the Stringer Bell principle. It's pretty simple. Like, I think like, but I do think also that there is a fear of a level of provocation that's possible that, if you're not going to participate in a particular crime and you're not talking about a particular thing, sometimes you can say some wild shit on social media and you might get in trouble. Like, I did publish a book like saying like you should go loot. So, I'm clearly a good example of this, I guess. And also I'm like a white girl in America, so I have some protection from some of that shit too. I would say never post anything you're going to participate in, even like to anything less public than this. This is about as public as you should post what you're doing. Never say what you're doing. Never say where you're going with your friends online. As much as you can avoid it. Obviously, we want to do some of that. Never talk about that stuff online. But also, I think we should be more bold about saying what we really think in some ways, rather than getting caught in these discourse fucking loops that certainly happen on Twitter. Instagram's like a mess. I don't even know. And I don't make TikToks, although there's some TikToks just seems like it's mostly really good jokes. I don't do a lot of politics on TikTok, but I think like that is a real space. It is a real material space. It is also the easiest space for them to surveil. But everywhere is really easy to surveil. We live in an era of like total fascist surveillance, and that shit is real. And so we do have to take risks, and we are not going to be totally safe because the government doesn't like when you say that we should like end their government and like burn down their state, and like the plantation owner doesn't like when you like make plans to burn down the American plantation, right? They're not fans of that. They really don't want you to say that, and so the more people who are saying it more boldly, while also not implicating themselves personally, I think the better is what I tend to think. But I also tend to think that we can get really, really hung up in discourse and the 5 minutes hate, and that stuff is really unproductive. And I'm guilty of it too, but like I think it can be really unhelpful as well. So I don't know, but everyone experiences that. I don't know.
We came up with a plan. Can we take your question and then do a last round of things, and then we can talk outside?
Speaking of discourse and getting caught up in discourse, do you guys have any thoughts and strategies for like shutting down the type of discourse that seems to arise when people start to like peace police and like they're like, oh, we shouldn't do that, the community doesn't want that, and like suddenly there's like this like sort of third person ghost community figure that they're using to like weaponize their own like peace policing. Like how do you prevent that from taking hold? Because once it starts to take hold, it's like an invisible force.
I agree. It continues to be an open. There are so many open questions, but yeah, we really do need to get better at the tactic of keeping the space open, keeping the ability to have that, to have the riot, to have the loot as a tactic, to keep that space open. Definitely. And I guess we're going to do kind of last comments real quick. Just to think about doing Big Brick Energy, we did a number of interviews, 15 different people, 5 different cities, and some of those recollections come into the piece, but there are some things that we just talked about that might never see the light of day, but it was truly beautiful to be able to be in those spaces and have these conversations again about what happened and like really understand it as a high point of what we did, and that it feels like it just got kind of quickly forgotten about. It was a moment, and then it receded, but it was real, and some real shit happened there, and it was beautiful. So yeah, I really enjoyed the interview portion of this.
On the social media piece, that don't have a clear answer, but one scary story is part of the research we did for this inquiry was also a lot of cold research. Like, we read a bunch of the police department and like city council official reports or after action reports, which is interesting because you see through the enemy's eyes how they weren't prepared and screwed up, but also the moves they made. And along the way, there's that oh, I'm pointing to you for the peace policing, but I was thinking about the social media question, I'm sorry. The Seattle police actually figured out that at a certain point that their radios were being monitored and people were putting the radio calls on Twitter, right? So then they created their own radio chatter about the Proud Boys coming so that it would get put on social media to both frighten people and get people, scared of one another, and also to get people to move in certain directions. So there's sort of this is like the Marxist cop-out, but it's a dialectical thing. It's like useful till it's not, It's an enabling condition until it's a limit. Then the question is like, what other modes of communication do we have that can layer on top of that? My only one closing comment that trying to tie into the peace police thing is I think there's more in here on it, and there's even more discussion we need to have about the multiracial unity race autonomy piece, because the peace policing thing is part of the dynamic. Because the way that depending on your context, white or non-black liberals turn toward the nearest person of color who vibes with their investments in property, and property in the self, which is being a rights-bearing subject, is relating to yourself as property, That dynamic is one of the drivers of the peace policing. And then on the flip side, I think we also saw there's like a very sensible, informed by 400 years of struggle, black skepticism of white and non-black intention. And that's something that you have to grapple with as soon as the uprising hits that exhaustion point, because then you're like, wait a minute, what happens tomorrow? And maybe tomorrow, a person in East New York, like talking to her neighbors, was saying, yeah, the neighbors were saying the cops are gonna get really mad busting up these protesters in downtown Brooklyn when the curfew's on, and they're gonna come and take it out on us. So like, I'm not gonna stick my neck out. So it's a very, very sensible and strategic assessment that needs to happen, which can then also get played on by the ruling class and the black or people of color elites who come and make the claim about, don't burn down our Bronx that we've been building up since the 70s, like, yeah, who owns the Bronx, Or the outside people are the either white fascists or, anarchist outside agitators. So all of a sudden that peace policing question has two different sides to it, because the race dynamic, you have to deal with both sides of it. And one of it is how do we maintain or build a white or non-black solidarity with black autonomy and black power, black working class autonomy? And on the flip side, it's all the questions that you're dealing with in a majority people of color or a black autonomous space. At least in my own experience in the Bronx, it's like, how do we relate to the white people who want to be in solidarity? How do we relate to the elites of our shared racial or ethnic category who are going to come at us in various ways, from scolding to making offers to truly represent us? And how are we going to deal with the problems that arise in the community when the uprising is happening, which is all the infrastructure questions. I think both of those need to be answered, and then the police policing is addressed through those. Sorry, that was a long closing comment.
Yeah, no, I think just to sort of, I think peace policing has been a really core part of control over the last 40 years. And in fact, in some ways it was a little less effective in 2020 than it was definitely in other movement waves, because shit was so widespread, and so you got a lot more paranoia policing, right? Rayshard Brooks's partner is actually a white fascist, and so internet sleuths picked her out, and then she faces time because she's grieving, and she fucks up at Wendy's and be like, look at this white person, doing this, and but then also white people aren't to be trusted in the street. That's a pretty in a riot context. Most of the time, white people rioting in America is not fucking good news. So it's very understandable that people are really nervous about that. So yeah, so there are all these questions. I think in sort of conclusion, I would say that I think it's very easy in the wake of movement waves like this to fall into despair. I think that it's very, very common what happens every wave, like from Occupy, like from Oscar Grant to the president, you go in the street, everything feels possible, it falls out, things feel impossible, you blame the people closest to you who are standing there next to you because it's their fault because they weren't trying hard enough. When you feel that, you are, this projection, right? It's classic projection. You're angry at yourself for not being able to win. We're angry at ourselves for not being able to take it further. That's real, that despair is real, that sadness is real. But also, this shit has been building over the last decade. And none of the material conditions, in the 70s, they were able to buy the movement out. They don't have that capacity in America. They can't really buy us out very easily, and they're clearly not willing to. So the material conditions really haven't changed, and the bottom keeps threatening to fall out of this economy. It's gonna happen. Like, I've been saying that, I feel like, for 5 years, though, so this Wile E. Coyote, like, just running in the air over the cliffside. Anyway, all of which is to say, either this shit will come back or we're doomed. So I choose to believe that this shit is coming back. And how can we, in that space that is opened when that happens, how can we build together stronger, come out of it stronger, and if it does recede, as it almost certainly will, because part of how the movement has to work is you have to believe you're going to win this time, right? This is it. This is the revolution. Like, that belief is part of the pleasure. It's part of what's amazing about being in there, right? Is like, you're experiencing freedom. You're alive. It's real. That's a beautiful feeling that we don't talk about a lot because it's scary to talk about how, like, vulnerable and alive and real things feel for a few moments, like just like a few days in our lives, and how dreary everything is in comparison to that sometimes. Those feelings, how do we extend that feeling of freedom, of really living, without, when we lose it, turning on each other in the future? And how can we build tactics so that we can have the most time having that feeling possible, and how we have the most time feeling free and being free together, and have the most people feeling that freedom, because once they feel it, they don't forget it. And I think that millions of people felt it in 2020, and they haven't forgotten, even if it feels like they have.
And thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.